And I, as a 6-year-old, was slightly horrified by this.
Oh. So welcome to the next episode of Endoscopy Essentials, and I'm more than happy to welcome my old friend George Webster from the United Kingdom. You are sort of the king of cholangioscopy, ERCP and other stuff, but we'll get to that. Today we want to meet the person George Webster. George, tell us a little bit about your background. Is there a medical background? Are you from London directly?
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks very much, Thomas, for inviting me. Very honoured to join you. No, I'm not from London originally. I was born in Sheffield in the north of England, where my father was at that time a senior registrar in surgery, so the grade below consultant, and then he got his consultancy in vascular surgery down in Southampton, which is where I grew up, and yes, had 2 older sisters, so I was the little boy, and
spoiled
yes.
by everybody?
Sorry?
Spoiled by everybody?
Well, in fact, my older sisters now tell me that I was enormously spoiled. I didn't feel particularly spoiled, but they claim that I was very spoiled. And yeah, and I suppose, one of the things we may be talking about is influences. And, my father was a very sort of 6-day-a-week, hard-working surgeon who would disappear in the middle of the night to do ruptured aortic aneurysms and then sometimes appear for Sunday lunch with a streak of arterial blood across his forehead. In fact, I recall in those days, which is the early 1970s, the tradition at Christmas was that the senior surgeon would carve the turkey for the patients who were still in the hospital, and I went along there. I must have been about 6, I suppose, and I went along on Christmas Day with my mother, who used to be a nurse, and as he carved the turkey, we went around the bed sort of saying hello, and my mother said to an old chap who was sitting there in a wheelchair with bilateral above-knee amputations, she commiserated that he was in hospital, and he said, yeah, I've had both my legs chopped off by Mr. Webster. And I, as a 6-year-old, was slightly horrified by this. And she said, oh, Wes, well, I'm sorry to hear that, but there must have been, you must have had a problem. Of course, he had diabetic peripheral vascular disease. And he said there was nothing wrong with them. And I was slightly traumatized as a 6-year-old. But yeah, so my father was, in the family business. And so I think that was probably an inspiration to...
at least it didn't put you off.
Didn't put me off, no. But
well, this is the first bio with pictures.
Okay.
I think we should make advantage of.
Okay.
And you have some very nice photographs of the background, so let's look at that.
Well, I suppose...
In the middle, that's your dad and you.
Yeah, and top left is with my mum, and that's me, babe in arms, with my 2 older sisters. And then on the right, a bit of advice for people. If you're stressed enough about your final medical exams, don't arrange to get married 3 days after you hope you've passed your final exams. But
you didn't know at that time?
That I was getting married, or that I'd passed. I didn't know if I'd passed. Well, I did by the time I got married, but I didn't during all the planning stage. And so anyway, it didn't turn out too bad. So Celia and I got married in 1991, and 34 years later, we're all very good. And bottom right is us with our 4 lovely kids. So that's my sort of background. And we live in London, and our kids are distributed at various points Actually, in fact, they're all in London. They're all in London, apart from my daughter in blue, Orla, who's a junior doctor in Brisbane at the moment.
Okay.
So all a good crowd.
So if we go back to the middle image, to the central image, was there any doubt that you would enter medicine at some stage? Did you have some different plans?
I think I was rather unimaginative in what I might do from a career point of view. My father was a surgeon, and from a very early age, I was interested in using my hands and doing things. In fact, and we might come onto it, I always thought that I would probably become a surgeon. I always had that as something I thought I would do. I wasn't sure that I was academically strong enough. Was
there a point from the very beginning?
Sorry?
Was there a point from the very beginning? Academic versus non-academic, was that?
I was never terribly academic. I just about did enough, and in fact, I think it's perhaps a lesson for others that the system in the UK is that in going to university, medical school or anything else, you apply to 5 different universities usually of different levels of difficulty to get in, and then you receive offers, and then you need to get your exams and go off to the one, hopefully the top one you've chosen. And so I applied for medical school and got 5 straight rejections, absolutely nothing. But we all have those forks in the road, and in fact that gave me the opportunity. I had no choice about it. Actually, in my exams, I did much better than my predictions suggested. But it did mean that I then needed to take what we call in the UK, perhaps elsewhere, a gap year, so a gap between school and university.
My son is doing that.
Right.
So
okay.
It's an old thing.
It's an old thing. It's an old thing, and actually a very for me, maybe not for everybody, but for me, it was a really very formative time because it not only taught me what I wanted to do, but the sort of career I absolutely didn't want to be involved in. So I spent even before that, I had an interest in woodwork and as I've mentioned, and so I got the chance to work in what I thought was a cabinet making company. So I thought I had this aspiration I was going to be making, beautiful bits of furniture, but in fact it was simply a factory sticking fabricated stuff together.
Okay.
And the useful thing for me was to, people there were working long hours, 5 days a week, and many of them hated every second of it. They simply did that job to make the money to allow them to, live at the weekend and perhaps pay their rent or whatever.
So working almost as much as your father, but with much less joy.
Yeah. And it was quite formative to say, you've got to be doing something that you enjoy, and I think within medicine I've certainly always felt, and I think we're very, very fortunate to be in that position.
So let's go to your medical journey. So you had the gap year, you said, failing at the first hurdle, which didn't put you off either.
Sure.
And so then Royal Free Hospital came, I can read.
Yeah, so my father's male consultants sort of teased me for going to the Royal Free Hospital because historically the Royal Free was the first medical school in the UK to accept women, and they teased me about that. But I was there for 6 years, and thoroughly enjoyed that. Had quite an early exposure to gastroenterology and hepatology because the Royal Free was very famous for having a liver unit set up by Dame Sheila Sherlock, who was one of the great names of hepatology. But I was there for 6 years.
The long-term advantage of accepting women.
Well, exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. And then moved into general training for several years in London, and then on to the sort of gastroenterology pathway.
So did you start as a liver guy?
Yeah, and in fact, I spent 3 years doing research into viral hepatitis with a very inspirational, well, two inspirational people really. Professor Jeff DeShaco, who was a viral hepatologist, and a researcher called Antonio Bertoletti, who taught me a fair bit about basic research, but also a lot about Italian cooking and the Italian way of life, and he was a great person to be mentoring me, but that was entirely sort of fortuitous because I had an initial research project into hepatitis C, which really wasn't very interesting at all. And then there was an outbreak of hepatitis B in North London that was bizarrely tracked back to a general practitioner who was giving his own alternative treatment to patients, in which he had a bottle of his magic serum, and patients would come along and he would draw a couple of milliliters of their blood, put the syringe in his magic serum, suck up a couple of milliliters of his magic serum, shake it up and inject it back in again. One of the fascinating things about that from an epidemiological point of view, but also from a basic immunology point of view, was that we were one of the first groups that could actually track the immune response to hepatitis B before patients developed symptoms. So we could...
Because at some stage you caught the guy and then you had all his early infected patients.
Exactly. So we then had all the patients who had been along, and we got interesting research. You know, I was very lucky to get a Lancet paper out of that. And again, in terms of forks in the road, really right up to consultant level, I had interviews to either be a parenchymal hepatologist or to really go down the line of HPB medicine and HPB endoscopy. I was working in Sydney at the time on a fellowship, and came back and was interviewed for the consultant post at the Middlesex Hospital, Peter Cotton's old alma mater, and working with a great mentor of mine, Adrian Hatfield, who was, you know, the sort of preeminent ERCPist through the 1990s in the UK.
So the surgeon came through again a little bit, and he
said,
I better do something interventional.
That's right. And actually, in fact, I was talking to my junior doctors, advising them about sort of career choices and specialty, and you know, advised them that, you know, one of the things we need to understand is whether we have a personality in which you need each day to have demonstrably made a difference. And it doesn't mean that you're a a good or a bad person, whether you do or you don't. But I'm certainly of the personality that, I've got colleagues who are able to plan 5-year immunology research projects and go home each day and feel they've done a good day. I could never do that.
Wait for the Nobel Prize.
Exactly. I'm much more take a bile duct stone out, do a procedure. It's much more my thing.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. You're a great teacher, right? So you're now on the other side. At some stage, you switch to the other side. You are an eminent teacher, aren't you? What are your teaching points?
Yeah.
You have a slide on that as well.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. And I suppose in terms of teaching, I've always had a passion for teaching, and I think that. I suppose passion is one of the things that I would really like to get across to those that I'm teaching and to our junior doctors and others. That as soon as you're not passionate, as soon as you're not interested in the patient, the medical problem, the procedure, you're going to perform badly, you're going to give bad patient care. And in fact, again, one of those moments in one's career was as a junior doctor. I was rotating through different hospitals, and we had a patient with an extraordinary and very rare cardiological problem, and I presented the case to the grouping of consultants, and none of them were interested, none of them were bothered, and I really thought at that time, do you know what, I don't want to work in an environment where everybody else is bored. And so I think in terms of teaching, I'm very fortunate to be working primarily at University College Hospital in London, which is attached to a big medical school, and a great group of junior doctors and medical students going through. But also like you have done through your career, trying to think about how to teach differently. For 15 years or so now, we've been doing our London Live endoscopy course, but actually been trying to innovate beyond that and seeing how we can move into doing things a new way, move into the sort of digital sphere, trying to make teaching more accessible, by not just teaching to people in a lecture theatre, but trying to get teaching accessible and a bit more democratic, really. I was struck that some years ago that really the only people who could receive our teaching were people who either had the logistics or the money to come into central London, so we've tried to democratise things a bit more, and we've set up this platform called Gastro Learning with a couple of fantastic colleagues, Taz El-Menabawi and Dave Graham, and that is looking to innovate with how we deliver it.
Okay, we were speaking about research a little bit.
Yeah.
You came from the liver, the holy grail of gastroenterology, at least for some years, and so that went slowly into the biliary ERCP business. I see here IgG4 related disease, which is sort of a transition, isn't it? Yeah,
well, in fact, it was a very different field. My first endoscopy paper was actually in gut back in 1995, and I don't think it would get into gut now, but it was just answering or trying to address the most simple of questions, which was, should we allow patients to drink before an endoscopy? What effect does that have on the volume of fluid in the stomach? And it was very different from the basic research I was doing on looking at targeted T cells, and I actually I realised that no, this is much more me. But I suppose a couple of areas. The IgG4 related disease was interesting in that it very, very much married clinical medicine with I suppose, academic inquiry, and it all started back in 2004. I was sat in our weekly surgical pathology meeting, and the first patient was presented as this chap who's had a Whipple's for pancreatic cancer. Let's look at the resection, and the pathologist said, "Oh, good news, no cancer." And then the surgeon, moved on and said, "Let's look at the next patient with pancreatic cancer, who's not doing quite so well and was on ITU." And he said, "Oh, he also doesn't have cancer." And the surgeon sort of said, "Oh, well, okay, let's move on." And I thought, hang on a minute. And that, in fact, from that, we reported our cohort of 11 patients with what at that time was described as autoimmune pancreatitis. And that was the first publication from the UK. And then really with great collaboration with colleagues at the Mayo and in Boston, we started to describe what to be fair, the Japanese colleagues had been doing for the previous 10 years of describing this disease, which now we recognise as a multi-system disease. And it's been very both clinically and academically interesting, looking to describe this disease. And we work very closely with colleagues in Oxford and as I say in Boston, and that's been a fascinating journey. Not high science, but just trying to bring together clinical observation with with trying to build a research, body of research to inform.
But it's still a clinical challenge. I mean, there's more awareness, so people more often think of, could this be autoimmune pancreatitis or IgG4-related disease? But on a given patient, it might be a challenge.
Oh, right, it is a challenge.
To have the nerves to wait and treat and see.
Okay. But actually, from that, other diseases we're now seeing, that, we've come to recognise a pattern of cholangiopathy with a pancreatic involvement. Oh, that's got to be IgG4 disease. And now we're seeing patients on chemotherapies, on checkpoint inhibitors, who in fact have exactly the same pattern. And even, in fact, we've got an abstract at ESGE Days on ketamine-induced cholangiopathy, recreational ketamine. And again, it's looking quite similar to this.
It's like eosinophilic esophagitis, which was not existent when I was a student, at least not in adults. Okay. So there's a lot of interventional endoscopy. Cholangioscopy, we'll cover that in separate podcasts. So that's our cliffhanger for this one.
Okay, fine.
Let's go to your work environment, teams, colleagues.
I think that incredibly fortunate to work with fantastic teams. Both my consultant colleagues who don't actually feature in this picture, but as we recognise, and one of the joys of interventional endoscopy or endoscopy in general is that it's a team effort, and our nursing teams are absolutely fundamental to that. And in fact, a bit of a shout out for bottom right in this picture is Mary, who on Tuesday this week celebrated 60 years of working within the National Health Service. And she won't mind me saying that she's 78. And last year she stayed behind to help with a patient who was having difficulty after an ERCP I'd done, and it was her 50th wedding anniversary. And I think that, we don't make enough. We don't make enough of the teams that we work with, and for us as consultants and individuals who get to travel and talk and stuff, I think that none of that would happen without the fantastic teams that we have the privilege to work with.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. But you're also internationally very well connected. You have a lot of friends worldwide through various groups and
Well, yeah, and that's
like here.
Well, here,
From
and
India to Augsburg and
all over the
Brussels,
Brussels, and even with Thierry Ponchon here. This is in Portugal. This was an ESGE meeting very soon after Brexit, and Thierry was giving me very justifiably a terrible time about Brexit, and we then went for sherry tasting in Porto, and were then reminded of the history of the British in the port business, and there was a nice crest there of some British king from the past. But no, I mean, I think one of the other enormous privileges and great joys, which I think medicine really does provide, is the opportunity to collaborate and work with colleagues from all around the world and build friendships that, most people doing most jobs, one doesn't have the mechanism of doing. So that's something that I've always enjoyed enormously.
Especially endoscopists, we are still a relatively small group, so we don't have this meeting of 80,000 radiologists or cardiologists. We still know each other, right?
I think that's right, and I think that again, none of us quite see how we are all in our day job, but I think as a group we get on well, and it's very collegiate, and it's something that I've enjoyed enormously.
No, absolutely. So almost at the end, there's one question. What does the private Webster do besides family and maybe other things?
It's
back to the roots.
Back to the roots.
Gap year.
Back to gap year. And in fact, with respect to the gap year, I worked in a factory for 6 months, which I didn't enjoy, and then the next 6 months I worked in a centre for students with disabilities, and there I worked in the workshop with an elderly man who was also a violin maker, and he showed me how you make a violin from scratch, and it completely blew me away, the level of technical skill. And I've always loved making things with my hands, and of course it does extend to ERCP, although I've said without the risks. So that's something that I don't have as much time to do as I wish I did, but still keeping it ticking over anyway.
I see. Okay, George, before we finalize, you brought some mottos, which I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, one of them, one at the top, sometimes sort of irritates my family, but I think carpe diem, seize the day, I think is something that we need in doing what we do professionally. As soon as you're bored and uninterested in what you're doing, then
the irritation is because
because I think that
you are too devoted, or
no. I think at times if one of my kids is sort of lazy on the sofa, I might suggest this. But so that's one. I've sort of alluded to this, but again, I often speak to junior doctors, and jobs come up, and they speak to me about whether they should go for it or not. And I do think that it's more important to look very carefully at the people you're going to be working with than the place you're going to be, because people make presumptions that this is a good unit because it's in a posh hospital, but actually if the relationships and the dynamics are bad, you can end up having a difficult or a miserable time.
I mean, infrastructure is probably important, but the rest, the remaining 80% is people.
And the point is that if you've got a good group, then that's your best chance to build the infrastructure. And then finally, and I think this is probably, if I had one motto, it is that you're most likely to be good at that which you enjoy. So, you know, and that's certainly been true of my career, that, you know, nearly 60 now, and if looking at what I do through the week, if somebody said, okay, you know, if you could drop everything but be left with one thing, what would it be? And it would be the sort of interventional endoscopy. And so if you're lucky enough, as I have and others of us have, to find an area that, you know, you continue to be interested in, that is probably the area that you're going to be best at.
Absolutely nothing to add. I'm very impressed. Thanks very much for this fantastic
Thanks,
interview.
Thomas. Thank you. Pleasure.